All right. So without further ado, my name is Brittany and I'm the coordinator for the Crow Wing County Master Gardener Volunteer Program. And have a hybrid setup today. So we have Dan Lee zooming in from Arizona, and we have people on Zoom, and we have participants in the library, a great turnout. So welcome. Dan Lee is a Crow Wing County Master Gardener volunteer. He grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota and spent 30 years practicing law. Now he's back. He's excited to be back to his first love of growing things. And he is the chair of our community giving project, which has last year donated over 4,700 pounds of food to the food shelves in Crow Wing County. And he's passionate, particularly about vegetable gardening. And he's talking on starting seeds today. So take it away, Dan.
Okay. Thank you, Brittany. And thank you, everybody, for patience getting started a couple of minutes late. As we all know, technology is wonderful when it works, and it can be extremely frustrating when it isn't working as intended. So the presentation is titled Starting Bedding Plants in the Dead of Winter. This is the second time I've done this, and when I did this presentation last year, it was the dead of winter. Unfortunately, this year we've got some iffy weather. And I want to just start out by saying, even though it looks like it's nice out, remember it's Minnesota and the weather can change very quickly, and we may find ourselves in a couple of weeks with a cold snap. So don't get too excited about gardening yet outside. So today I'm going to try to cover the basics of starting bedding plants for yourself, whether it's vegetables or flowers. I'm going to go over some things like why would you want to go to the expense and the time to do it. Talk a little bit about the timing of when you would start bedding plants, the kinds of locations you have to have in order to be successful starting bedding plants, some of the materials and supplies on a very general level. We're going to talk about hardening off, which is getting plants ready to be transplanted outdoors. And we're going to talk about one of the dreaded diseases that can occur when you're starting bedding plants called damp moth. What I'm not going to cover is the specific plants to plant. And there's a reason for that, because basically any kind of seed can be started from scratch indoors. And then I'm not going to cover where to purchase supplies for your activity. I will show you examples of different supplies that can be used, but they're just examples. So first of all, why would you go to the work of starting bedding plants? The first reason is the availability of a wider range of potential plants. So when you go to a nursery in Minnesota, oftentimes when you go from one to another, you will see exactly the same kind of plants. Why is that? Well, it's because most of the bedding plants that are sold in nurseries actually come from growers that are transferring those plants to the individual stores where you're going. And that means that it's always sort of the same group of plants that are being distributed from those growers. What that also means is that there probably isn't as wide a variety of colors of plants if you're looking for flowers or different types of vegetables. So starting your own plants from seed automatically gives you a much wider variety of plants that you can start. The other big thing is you can control the timing of your outdoor planting. So in Minnesota, as most of us know, in a normal year, you don't want to put any bedding plants out until around June 1st or even a little bit later, because that's the average last frost date in Minnesota. Because you're controlling when you're starting your plants, you can back into when to start your plants to make sure that on the proposed planting date that you want to plant your garden, you've got exactly the right size plant to plant. you can control your cost. Bedding plants have become very expensive over the last few years. It's not uncommon to see people go in and end up buying several $100s worth of bedding plants. To offset that, it's much, much cheaper to reuse pots or trays and other materials to start your own bedding plants from seed, because the seed is roughly 10% of the cost of a bedding plant. So it's a way to control your costs. And then let's not forget, there's a lot of satisfaction starting your own bedding plants and having something unique in your garden that you started from scratch that you don't necessarily see in any of the nurseries that you might have otherwise gone to get bedding plants from. And then, a normal year where it's pretty bleak outside, beginning of March with a lot of snow, you would be bringing some green into your house. And that always brings a little bit of joy to especially people like my wife, who has a little bit of seasonal affective disorder and needs a little bit of green or something joyous in the middle of a cold, dark winter. So let's now move on to a little bit of seed basics to ground everybody in what a seed is and what we're going to be trying to do with that seed. So first of all, a seed is the fertilized mature ovum of a flowering plant. And what that means is it's actually got an immature plant inside the seed. And it may not look like a plant, but it's actually there if you were to dissect the seed. You will actually see young leaves. You'll see a young root. You will see a food supply, which is the energy that the young plant needs to grow until it can produce its own food through photosynthesis. And then you have a coating around the exterior of that seed that protects that seed from the elements. Because if you didn't have it, it would either dry out or desiccate, and the seed would not be viable anymore. Anybody out there knows that there are seeds in a variety of different sizes. And in putting this presentation together, I was fascinated to find that the largest seed known to man in the world is actually a double coconut coming in at over 40 pounds. So obviously that's a big seed. And that's a big seed because that particular plant, where it is native, needs to have a large food source for an extended period of time because of the growing conditions, in order to make sure that that seed can grow into a mature plant that's viable on its own. On the other end of the spectrum, what's the smallest seed? Well, biblically, it was the mustard seed. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, the Bible didn't have that one right. The world's smallest seeds are actually orchid seeds. And if you think about it, an orchid is a plant that grows in the canopy of a rainforest, and the seeds are actually moved around by wind. So the orchid seeds need to be extremely small, and they happen to be the smallest known to man. And this diagram shows the size of different kinds of seeds. And as you can see, an orchid seed is actually smaller than a grain of sand, which means it can be blown around very, very easily. Let's move now to what a seed needs to grow. So you can't just put a seed in the ground and expect that that seed is going to grow. You have to actually give the seed the things it needs in order to germinate and propagate into a mature plant. The first thing is it needs water, but it needs the right amount of water. If it's too wet, you can actually destroy the seed because it may get fungus on it, or it may get waterlogged. It may die because of too much water. If it's got too little water, you may have the same problem. It may not germinate, or it may germinate but then die off because it doesn't have enough water. You need heat. We all know that in the middle of winter, if you put a seed outside in the ground, it's not going to germinate. And that's because over the millennia, seeds have been slowly genetically changing to make sure that the seeds for a particular region germinate when the conditions are the optimal for that plant. In other words, when it's warm enough consistently for it to germinate and mature into a good plant. If genetically it germinated too early in some situations, you might have a plant that would start to grow and then would die off because of colder weather. So they actually are very smart genetic um, uh, materials which are optimized for the place that they were developed or for the natural environment that they were in. In some cases, seeds also need light. They will not germinate if they don't have light. But unfortunately, on the other end of the spectrum, there's also seeds that need dark in order to germinate. And that's all because of this genetic coding to make sure that the plants germinate at the optimal time for that particular geographic region or that particular ecosystem to make sure that that plant will be viable or grow into a viable plant. We also have cold periods that are necessary for some seeds. A great example of that is an apple seed. If you were to, take an apple, eat it, take the seeds out from the apple, put them in the ground, they wouldn't automatically germinate. They need a 1 to 2 week period of below freezing temperatures in order for that seed to germinate. And why is that? Well, again, it goes back to this genetic coding to make sure that the plant, when it germinates, is going to have the optimal opportunity to grow into a mature plant. If an apple seed, for example, was planted in the fall and would germinate then, it would be a wasted seed because in Minnesota because of the freezing effect on the plants. So what genetically has happened is chemicals have been built up in the seed through millennia of development that have to have a cold period for 1 to 2 weeks to break those chemicals down, but then would allow the seed to germinate. So seeds are really interesting, very complex mechanisms for growing into plants. The other thing is some seeds need a process called scarification, which is a fancy word for something that breaks down the seed coat around the seed. The reason that's there genetically is in some environments, you need to make sure that not every seed germinates at the same time, or there has to be enough moisture for the seed to germinate so that it will become a viable plant, or it needs to be wind blown for a period of time to break down that seed coat so that it disperses the plant. All of those mechanisms basically are ensuring that the plants that do germinate are going to be as viable as possible. So one of the questions that as a master gardener I get is how long do seeds last? And we all know that when you go into a nursery store or a seed store, they want to sell you this year's seeds because that's what they have. The reality is seeds last a lot longer than most people think. Properly stored, 3 to 12 years for most vegetable seeds, for example. Historically, though, the oldest known seed grown into a viable plant was actually a Judean date palm that was found at Masada in Israel. They believe it was about 2,000 years old and it grew into a viable date palm. The reason it lasted that long, it was preserved in a cool, dry place and was never frozen throughout that entire period of time. So in this table, to make the point even further, I've got a table which shows the average length of time that various seeds will last. And as you can see, beans can last from 5 to 8 years. Flint corn from 6 to 12. Winter squash, 6 to 10 years, as long as the seeds are stored in a cool, dry, dark place. What that means is when you go and buy that package of seed, don't throw it away if you don't use it all. Keep it for the next year or actually several years. And it's a great way of actually saving quite a bit of money on your garden plants. Now let's talk a little bit about the timing of when you would start your seeds. Each plant genetically has its own unique germination timetable and its time to maturity. So in Minnesota, for example, if the average frost date is around June 1st, and then the average frost in the fall is sometime around, say, September 15th, that basically means you have 90 to 105 days of an active growing season in our geographic area. Why is that important? Well, if you bought a plant that when from you planted it would take longer than 105 days to mature into whatever it was you were trying to grow, why go through the effort or waste the effort in putting it in? It wouldn't be a viable plant for you. You can trick that a little bit, though, by starting bedding plants indoors and then transplanting them out. So there are plants that have a maturity of 70 to 120 days that you could start indoors and actually have viable plants outside in Minnesota because you've tricked them into starting their growing period indoors first before you transplant them out. Where do you get the information about how long a plant takes to grow? Well, the starting place is the seed packet. And most seed packets are very, very good at giving you a lot of information. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people who will buy a seed packet, look at the front, see the pretty picture of whatever it is to grow, and they never turn it over and look at the back side of the package, which is going to have a lot of critical information. So for example, in this particular picture, you've got things like 7 days to harvest. In other words, from the time you plant it to the time that it will be ready to harvest, the sweet pepper is about 70 days. So if you put it in on June 1st, sometime in the middle of August, you would be harvesting peppers. The other thing that's on the back of the package is the depth to put the seed. In this case, about 1/4 of an inch. It's got spacing information. This one says 18 to 24 inches apart for each one of the plants. Any closer than that, and you probably are going to hurt the yield because the plants are too crowded. Anything wider than that, and you're probably wasting garden space, or the garden isn't going to be as productive as you would like it to be. The other thing this particular package shows is once you plant your seed, however you're doing it out in the garden or by seed starting, it takes between 10 and 21 days for that seed to actually germinate, which is the process of actually starting to grow. What I do is I work backwards from the maturity date to figure out when I need to plant these plants. In the case of a sweet pepper, I can plant it outdoors around June 1st, and I would again have viable fruit to harvest in the middle of August. If I wanted to have fruit to harvest earlier than that, say I wanted it in July, that means I would have to start the plants 70 days before when I want that plant to be harvestable. And that would require indoor seed starting. And again, this particular package is absolutely wonderful because it gives all of these critical pieces of information like days to harvest, days to emergence, germination timetable, etc. Unfortunately, not all seed packets are as helpful as this particular one from Burpee is. Sometimes they will have one of these critical pieces of information, but they won't have others. What I'm suggesting is if you find yourself in that situation, go out to the University of Minnesota Extension Service or other reputable universities to find out specifically what that particular plant's needs are as far as depth, spacing, days to harvest, etc. Avoid marketing sites because marketing sites for a lot of the seed companies will exaggerate how big plants will get or how fast they will mature. Where if you go to a university or extension site, you will get research-based information to help you with your decision making. Moving on, let's talk a little about timing. So your timing is also dependent on specific issues with regard to particular seeds. So for example, as I mentioned, apples require a cold period. So if you had saved seed from an apple, you would need to either leave it outdoors for 1 to 2 weeks or put it in your freezer in a bag for 1 to 2 weeks to break down the chemicals that inhibit its germination time. So you have to think through that timing as well as when you should start a seed when you're going to start things indoors. You have to think through things like scarification. So you've saved some seeds. Do those seeds need some special treatment to break down the seed coat around the body of the seed? That also plays into timing. Sometimes scarification is accomplished by rubbing the seeds with grit or having them wind blown around, or I've seen people put seeds inside of a rock tumbler with fine grit and running it for a day or so to scarify the outside of a seed. Particularly, you do that with things like olives. Olives have a very, very hard coat. You either need to use a file to break down a little bit of the seed coat so that water can get in and it can germinate, or you do things like put them in a rock tumbler and let it run for a little while to break that seed coat down. This table actually gives a few examples of what has to happen in order for the scarification to allow the seed to germinate. Gourds, you nick a little bit of the seed. Sometimes you soak the seed in water, complete water, overnight or for a couple of days to soften the seed coat. Sometimes you use a nail file or things like the olive where you can actually use a rock tumbler to scarify the exterior of the seed. Most seeds that need scarification, if you're buying them from a commercial company, will already be scarified before you get them. This really becomes more of an issue if you are doing seed saving yourself. And you have to think through, what am I going to do in order to scarify that seed to allow it to grow? And then, of course, there are some timing issues associated with slow growing seeds. The best example I can think of is I've started avocado pits many, many times. And it can take 90 days to 120 days for an avocado pit to actually germinate. So if you've got one of those unique types of seeds, you have to think through that process to know how long it's going to take for that seed to germinate before it grows into something that you could actually plant outdoors. Location is also important in your seed starting process. You can't just put the seeds anywhere in your house or in your shop or your outbuilding and have a good result. First of all, think through issues like, is the location I want to do my seed starting safe from traffic, pets, drafts, excessive heat, or excessive cold? You need to think through the space that you're going to need for seed starting, because you might start out with some very small trays that have these tiny little seeds in them. But once the plant's germinated, they get bigger, and they get bigger a lot faster, and you have to have enough space for success with your seed starting and the plants that you're trying to get ready for transplanting outdoors. You have to provide enough space for them as they grow. That can be vertical space. It can be horizontal space, depending on what kind of plant that you are growing. You want to also look for a place that has an air temperature above 60 degrees consistently. Notice 60 degrees is not too cool. It's not too hot. It's just right for most plants. And the best place I can think of for most people to start plants is indoors in a basement that is heated. Because most times the basement is heated to between 50 and 65 degrees to make sure that the pipes and other things inside a home don't freeze. And that's a perfect temperature for most seed starting. The location also has to have things like easy access to water. So you don't want to be carrying water across your home or large distances to get to your plants. It's just inconvenient, and it makes the process more difficult for you. You need to have easy access to power, particular power if you're going to be using grow lights or heat mats or fans or humidifiers or dehumidifiers. All of these things can help you overcome some issues with the particular location that you are picking for your seed starting activity. In this particular picture, this is actually some cannabis plants that somebody built an enclosure around. And the nice thing about this enclosure is it reflects the sunlight because of the silver foil around, so that it's maximizing the effect of the grow lights. It contains it in a small enough space so it controls the humidity of the enclosure. It controls the amount of light in the enclosure, and it even has a fan in the back that's blowing air throughout the area so that it's maintaining a constant humidity. And it's also strengthening the plants because they have a little bit of movement inside of this enclosure. So the point of this picture and the slide is you can, depending on where you want to grow your things, overcome some issues by building an enclosure around the plants that you're trying to start. Avoid windowsills. I remember my grandmother growing all kinds of plants in her windowsill. The problem is the plants that she was trying to grow in the windowsill were also indoor plants that were tolerant of extremes in cold and heat, primroses and things of that nature. It is not an ideal place for most plants. The reason it's not ideal is during the winter, it can be the coldest place in the house at night because it's not getting any radiant heat from the sun. During the day, it can be the hottest place in the house because of the added radiant heat coming in to an already heated indoor space. The sunlight coming in is also very, very weak compared to the use of an artificial light close to the plant. So a lot of times plants in a windowsill are going to become quite leggy. And in fact, the picture that I have here shows plants that are bending in this windowsill toward the light, and they are getting taller and leggy as a result of it not being the right kind of light or the right intensity of light for those plants. Finally, during the winter, we also have to remember day length is much, much shorter than it is during the normal growing season during the summer. And so if you're starting plants only using windowsill light, they're actually being starved from day one of the amount of light that they would normally need in order to grow into healthy plants. And personal experience, windowsills aren't great because if you spill any water, which is inevitable when you're starting plants, that you're going to be watering things, you can damage the window casings. And I have done that by being a messy gardener in a windowsill. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about growing mediums. And everybody has an opinion about what's the best growing medium for starting plants. Seed starting mixes. You know, some people love these potting mixes that are for seed starting. They're extremely light. They're filled with a lot of vermiculite and other materials, so they drain very, very well. They're easy for young seedlings to grow through. It's not a bad choice, not a bad choice at all. Peat pellets. These happen to be a personal favorite of mine, and we'll get into that in a little bit about why I think peat pellets are such a novel and important addition to the arsenal on seed starting. Basically, what they are is a dry little pellet in this picture that when you add water to it, it swells up and it retains about the perfect amount of moisture inside that pellet for seeds to start. You can just use clean soil though. I mean, any good flower or vegetable soil will be fine for seed starting as long as you manage the moisture content appropriately. You also need containers as you're starting plants. They can be as simple as pots that you have around, cups. In this case, red Solo cups were used. And what this gardener did is drilled a little hole in the bottom of the cup, put some garden soil in, put the plant, a seed that they wanted to start, and off they go. Newspaper pots. In Crow Wing County, we have a master gardener who is really adept at folding newspaper into these little containers that you see in the photograph for starting seeds. And the nice thing about this is it's a great way to recycle old newspapers into something useful. You can use flats, which come in a wide range of sizes. I've seen flats that are only for 8 different plants, all the way up to 72 individual cells for that many plants. And then trays and clear covers. In this picture, it's actually a kit where it comes with a tray, it comes with the peat pellet, it comes with the individual cells inside the trays for each one of the peat pellets, and then a clear plastic cover that goes over the outside to maintain moisture while you're germinating the plant. So there's a wide variety of ways that you can start your seeds. I'm going to specifically talk a little bit about peat pellets because they are very, very helpful when it comes to the amount of work you have to put in. So one way you can do it is you just get a tray, you add your peat pellets inside the tray, evenly spaced, you add water, and what you end up is these swelled pellets. And in the photo on the right, you can see that they were put in this tray, swelled up, and they support each other. So they don't tip over because they were placed in there close enough that when they swelled up, they are stable. It's a great way to do it. The alternative is to use a tray, use one of these inserts that has a space separate for each one of the peat pellets. You put the peat pellet in there, and then you can see in the picture to the right, you've got a tray, you've got the individual cells, the peat pellet inside that, and so it supports itself. I actually like this method the best. And the reason I like this method the best is the plants can get much bigger in these cells before you have to transplant them because you've got the added stability of the tray having these individual cells inside to hold the peat pellet stable. Uh, I don't like to transplant any more often than I have to. And this way I can let the small plants get bigger before I have to transplant. Some other things that you should think about with seed starting is heat mats. So what a heat mat is in this picture, it's a little electrical device. You plug it into the wall. It has a thermostat inside, which maintains a specific temperature on the bottom side of the tray. You actually put the tray on top of it. It is a remarkable tool in that it, in some studies, will double the germination rate and cut the germination time in half. Remember that seed packet early on in the presentation where it said germination in 10 to 21 days? With a heat mat, you probably are going to have germination closer to the 10 days. Without a heat mat underneath, it's probably going to be closer to the 21 days. So it's a great way of speeding up germination and having more consistent germination simply by keeping the soil at a constant warm temperature. And when I say warm, it's just slightly warm to the touch. It's not hot at all, because if it was hot, you might boil off the moisture in the soil. The other thing about heat mats is sometimes the location that you put your plants will have drafts from time to time. And the draft is going to cool off the soil or cool off the plants. With a heat mat below, you're moderating that temperature and the drafts can be overcome a little bit because of the use of the heat mat. Now let's talk a little bit about grow lights. In particular like fluorescent light tubes. The reason I like them is they're relatively cheap. They're easy to install. They take very little energy, and you can find them almost anywhere. In this particular picture, it's a fluorescent light that is suspended. This is actually just a shop light, and it's suspended over the plants in a way that can be raised and lowered as the plants grow. You can use LED lighting. Same concept, you would want to suspend it over your plants and raise and lower it as the plants grow. The thing with LED lights and fluorescent lights is both of them put out very little heat. They both are almost identical in terms of providing the plants with the spectrum of light that they need in order to grow well. The thing I don't like about LED lights is they're still quite a bit more expensive than fluorescent light tubes. And then finally, there is specialized grow lights. They come in a variety of different sizes and bulb types. It may be that you have a desk lamp that you're going to use for a while to start your plants. This might be the best way for you to utilize that desk lamp by just replacing the bulb with a grow light for your purposes. Next on lighting, let's talk a little bit about how you should use it. So first of all, it should be just a few inches above the soil or the plants as you're starting those plants. And then what you do is you adjust it upward as the plants grow. In the first picture, it's a grow light over a bunch of plants. And as you can see, it's probably 6 inches above the tops of the plants. It shouldn't be any higher than that at this stage, and it should be only slowly moved up as the plants reach a particular height. In the second picture, this is actually a device that I made out of PVC pipe and a shop lamp. So it doesn't have to be a very expensive contraption that you are buying. It can be something that you can make yourself from very common things at almost any lumber yard or supply store. The suspension method is entirely up to you. These are just two examples. I have seen people actually hang them from rafters. So it is entirely dependent on the application and the place that you're going to be trying to start your plants. The last thing I'm going to say about lighting is be very careful to avoid any light source that generates heat. The reason is if it generates heat, too much heat, you're going to dry out your plants. You may actually scald them, or you may actually burn them as the plants start touching the light. The reason I like fluorescent and LED lights the best is they put out very, very little heat. And the reason is most of the energy that's being used is just putting out light. It's not putting out any radiant energy like a traditional incandescent bulb. So they are a great option for most gardeners to start their plants. Then there's some miscellaneous things to think about as you're starting your plants. For one thing, if you're going to use a grow light, you don't want to have the grow light on for 24 hours. I, in particular, don't like having to be on a schedule where I have to turn it on myself manually and turn it off at another time. And so a timer is a great option. And that timer can control the lights or control fans. A lot of times gardeners will have fans where they are starting their seeds. And the reason for doing that is it helps control the moisture in the area, but it also moves the leaves on the plants a little bit, which stresses the plants a little bit and actually makes them stronger. The humidity level in the area you're starting plants is also important. If it's too low, what happens is the soil is going to dry out faster, and it may be difficult for you to have the right level of soil moisture if the air is too dry. By the same token, if the air is too moist, you may have problems with fungal infections and other diseases. And so sometimes, depending on the location that you're putting your plants for seed starting, you may need to have a dehumidifier or a humidifier. The easiest one for me to give as an example is most basements have quite a bit of moisture in them. And so a dehumidifier is often something that you need to have in order to maintain a consistent moisture content in your air. You also have to think about fertilizer, but it's not as big a deal as it is with more mature plants out in your garden. Remember when we talked about the seed and what the seed's made up of? Well, there is a food source there, and that food source is all the energy that seed needs in order to grow its first seed leaves and get to the point where photosynthesis can take over and the plant can start to generate its own energy. So one of the biggest mistakes a lot of gardeners make is they fertilize the water that they're using for seed starting. And they can actually burn or harm the young plants by doing that, by creating an environment that has too many chemicals in it. What you want to do is you want to not fertilize your water for the first few weeks, and then only fertilize with a very weak mixture of fertilizer thereafter as the plants are starting to mature. This is a pet peeve of mine, plant markers. The reason it's a pet peeve is I have over time grown so many plants and then markers or the organization has fallen down in some fashion where I can't remember what particular variety I have in what particular tray. So take some time, think it through, make sure that every single one of your seedlings is marked in such a way that the marker is going to last for a long time. And you learn all kinds of things like if you use Sharpies they are not permanent when they're in a wet environment. And so you might have marked them really well when you started the seeds, but after time with moisture, you can't even read the marker anymore. The best thing I've found is to use paint pens and some type of a permanent plastic stake so that it uh, lasts the entire season as you're trying to grow your plants. And then, there are a variety of other things depending on how you're starting your plants. Everything from garden tools like gloves, watering cans. I've seen people use eyedroppers, spoons to lift plants out, etc. Now let's talk about sowing seeds a little bit. So remember the seed packet? Seed packet's a great source of information as far as how you should, how deep you should plant your seed, as well as how closely your plant should be transplanted out into your garden. If your seed packet doesn't tell you exactly how deep to put the seed, the rule of thumb is if the seed is a 1/4 inch wide, you would put the seed an inch deep. Now that would be a pretty big seed, and that would be something like a corn would need to be about an inch into the soil. Most seeds are much smaller, and so it's really very close to the soil surface that you would put them. Why is that? Well, because they need light oftentimes to germinate. Again, as you're doing your sowing, make sure you identify each container or tray with some kind of a permanent plant tag so you know what it is you've got in that tray for starting. The seeds that require light, the best way to plant them is at the required depth, but with a very thin layer of something like vermiculite or a very porous, light soil so that the light can penetrate to the seed. For those plants that have to have darkness, I put them inside of a plastic bag, like a black garbage bag, so that it blocks out all light, and then check it regularly to see when the plants have germinated. And there are quite a few plants that do require that dark period. Remember, we talked a little bit about how long seeds last. So if the seeds you're using are 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, and you're worried about your germination rate, the simplest thing to do is plant 2 or more seeds in each cell as you're planting your plants, and then removing the least healthy germinated plants as they start growing. Again, it's a great way to use older seed and avoid the expense of having to buy new seed every single year. Most gardeners who've started plants have had a bout of something called damp off or seedling disease. And as we've been going through the presentation, I've been mentioning moisture management quite a bit. Things like humidifiers or dehumidifiers, fans to move air around. And the reason I am mentioning those things as much as I am is the biggest single mistake that most gardeners make is not managing the moisture content in their growing area and having it too moist, which promotes a fungal disease by the name of damp off. And it's because you've got too moist a growing condition for the young seeds. This is a picture of seedlings that have these little brown spots, and that's damp off. Unfortunately, once you have damping off in a seed tray, almost all of those seeds or those seedlings are going to die. It's because these are fungal diseases that are very easily transported from one cell in a tray to another. And once it gets started, it's almost impossible to get it to stop. The time period that it occurs is right after germination, but before the plant has a mature enough root system to actually produce the uh, nutrients that the plant needs to continue to grow. And so it's usually in that first week to 2 weeks after germination when you first see the plants germinate. Unfortunately, it's not just one fungus. There are many funguses that can cause this. The common issue is overly moist conditions, and you manage that by making sure that you're keeping your peat pots, if you're using it, or your soil moist, but not overly wet. And you're allowing a period of time for things to dry out a little bit before you're adding more moisture. In fact, I know a lot of gardeners that will take a spray bottle and they will just use that to gently moisten the soil surface periodically rather than watering with a watering can to individual cells. Again, it's a strategy to keep the moisture as consistent as possible, not too wet and not too dry. Transplanting seedlings. So now you've got your plants ready to transplant from one size pot to another. The thing about seedlings is they actually like being cramped when they're small. They're delicate little plants, and they like a small little area. But at some point, they get big enough you need to transplant them. But they're still delicate. In this particular photo, we've got a picture of somebody who is actually using a knife and very carefully inserting the knife in the cell, trying to pull out the soil and lift that little seedling out so that it can be moved to a bigger container. Well, the issue with doing that is you've got a very delicate soil mixture inside that cell. And so a lot of times as you're lifting it out, the soil can start to crumble and kind of fall away. That's why using a knife or something to lift it out like a almost like a spatula or a spoon is a good way of trying to minimize the damage you're doing to this tiny, tiny little plant. The other mistake that a lot of people do is they will hold the seedling by the stem. Well, that's a mistake because if you damage the stem, that little seedling's going to die. Better strategy is if you have to stabilize it with your hand, hold it by a leaf. Very delicately hold it by a leaf. The reason that's a better strategy is if that little seedling loses one leaf, it's probably going to be fine. It might set it back a little bit. But if you damage the stem, you've probably killed the plant. As I've mentioned many times so far, I love peat pellets. Well, the reason I love peat pellets for seed starting is if you're in this stage where you need to transplant, with peat pellets, all you have to do is go in and hold the outside of the peat pellet, lift the peat pellet out, and transplant it into your bigger container. Because there's a small silk case around the peat pellet that holds it together, it's much, much easier transplanting little seedlings because of the use of the peat pellet. Now let's talk a little bit about hardening off. So hardening off is the process by which you get your delicate little plants ready to go outside. Up to this point, you've had them indoors. They're in a controlled environment as far as light, controlled environment as far as moisture, controlled environment as far as wind or heat and cold. And so they're like human beings in that they love this consistency, but they need to be treated a little bit delicately. Think of it like in the spring when you go outside and you get the first rays of sun, it's very easy for people to get sunburned. Well, plants are a little bit the same way. So you have to be careful about how you start to introduce them into the outdoors. It's a little bit true that as you're moving plants outside, what you're doing is you're stressing them, making them a little bit stronger through the stressing process. And you start by putting them outdoors in a location that's as sheltered as you can find, sheltered from the wind, the cold, still has light, doesn't dry it out too much, and you only leave them out for a couple of hours. The next day, you take them out and you leave them out there for a little bit longer. And you keep gradually doing that, paying close attention to some days if it's going to rain or be windy, you don't even take them out during this 1 to 2 week period of hardening off. But the process is basically extending your time outdoors for those plants, giving them an opportunity to acclimate to being outdoors over this 1 to 2 week period. When you're ready to plant them outdoors, one of the other big mistakes that a lot of gardeners will do is it's a nice sunny day. They want to be outdoors because it's a nice sunny day. And so I'm going to go plant my plants, and I'm going to pick a nice afternoon where it's warm and sunny. And that's the wrong time to plant your delicate little plants. You want to pick a day, if you at all can, that's a cloudy day, late in the afternoon. In other words, it's not going to sun scald them. It's going to give the plant a little bit of time to acclimate themselves to their new environment once you've transplanted. Most times, these young plants, because it's traumatic to have their roots moved around and planted, are going to wilt a little bit. Usually they will recover as long as they're watered well afterwards. Oftentimes I will use a row cover or something to protect them for 1 or 2 days, even after transplant and after hardening off, simply because they're still delicate and they're still getting used to the outdoors. And then when you're transplanting them out, think about the plant depth that you're planting them. So in this particular picture, these are plants that a master gardener used the folded newspaper method to produce these pots. But you can't just take that container and put it in the soil. What you have to do, and what you should do, is actually cut the top of it down to the soil level and cut some holes gently in the base of the pot so that when you put it in the soil, the roots have an easy, fast way to grow and grow into the soil. Unfortunately, I've seen people take either these kinds of pots or peat pots that they think are organic and just stick them in the soil a little bit above the soil surface. Well, next time you get a rain, what happens? Rain hits the plant, goes into the pot, and it sits inside this container that you've basically planted into the soil. It overwaters the plant, and they don't do very well. So even using these things like peat pots or these newspaper pots, think about how you're planting the plant so that it's going to have the most space for the roots to spread into quickly, and that it's going to drain appropriately. Finally, I've talked a lot about a lot of different topics with seed starting. The University of Minnesota Extension Service has really good materials about seed starting. Here are some of the resources that are out there through University of Minnesota, as well as the University of Iowa. The thing you want to do if you are looking for resources on seed starting is go to one of the major university extension services. All of the research they have is verified through the scientific method. If you go to a lot of the marketing sites that are out there, you can get a lot of misinformation, and some of it's good, but a lot of it can actually harm your experience starting plants. Finally, Brittany introduced me as a master gardener in Crow Wing County. We're a chapter of the University of Minnesota Master Gardener Program. This slide has the priorities that we have, which include horticultural skills, local food, climate change, nearby nature, clean water, pollinators, biodiversity. if you're interested in any of these things, think about joining the Master Gardener program. It's a wonderful program where you are taught horticultural skills and then provide service to the community that you live in through volunteerism. And we'd love to have more Master Gardeners in Crow Wing County and across the state. And I'll leave you with, if I didn't answer a question for you, you can always go to the Ask a Master Gardener site at Crow Wing County or call this number. You will have a Master Gardener who will take your question and try to give you research-based answers to whatever questions you might have. And with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions that might be there.
All right, thank you, Dan. I know we have a few questions in the chat from the Zoom participants. I also want to do a quick plug before people leave that we will be having a presentation here next April. So the series happens the second Tuesday of every month, and that will be April 9th, and it will be Starting a Garden, the Basics. So we have Anita Bolt talking about how to start a garden. So first off in the chat, one question was, at what time in the process do you remove the heat pads?
The heat pads are really necessary during the period of time from planting until the plants have germinated and maybe a week after that. Once the plants have germinated, you can slowly wean the plants off the heat mat. I sometimes will turn them on for an hour or two each day just to make sure that the soil isn't getting too cold. But it's really through that planting through germination date that it's most important.
Okay, thank you. Another question is in regards to the lighting and the optimal spacing from the plants. Would you then recommend to put plants of a similar growth rate in a flat so that the light doesn't burn part of the plant?
That's absolutely the best solution. I've through experience, you learn that if you put mixed matched height plants in a flat, it becomes very difficult to light the tray because they're growing at different heights. And so it's a great strategy to plant similar height plants in trays so that you don't have that mismatch of lighting.
All right, great, thank you. Question regarding the peat pellets. Does the peat pellet liner actually disintegrate? Is there something we should do, as I have had some that the lining on the outside never went away and I feel hindered the growth?
So in most cases, that lining will be completely gone by the fall. There are a few times where perhaps the plant wasn't in as wet an environment as others, where you will see a little bit of the remnant of the silk-like material at the base. But you will do way more damage to the plant than you think if you try to remove that when you're transplanting the plants. So I would just put it in the ground. If there's a little bit of it left when you're cleaning up your garden at the end of the year, you can remove it at that point. But generally, they will disintegrate.
Okay. And then back, somebody is questioning, so we do not need to use seed starting mix.
You don't need to. The advantage of using a seed starting mix compared to regular garden soil is it helps you manage moisture, because most garden soils are pretty heavy, where seed starting mixes are pretty light and will allow moisture to move through them and drain much better. Remember, moisture management is one of the critical things to do when you're starting these delicate plants.
Okay, and from the same person asking about the seed starting mix, they're wondering if they do use it, do we then switch to potting soil when transitioning to larger pots? How many leaves should plants have before transitioning to larger pots?
So you absolutely would want to transplant from the seed starting mix to whatever is most consistent with the kind of soil that you're going to be planting the plant in outdoors, so that it has an opportunity to get acclimated to that little bit more dense soil. I don't think there's any rule of thumb how uh, what the ratio should be between these two soils. It's more about when you need to transplant them because they're getting too big in the size pot you have, you transplant it to the appropriate size, next size bigger pot. Hope that answered the question.
All right. Do you go by a rule of thumb for how many leaves before plants transition, or is it more just kind of a different rule of thumb?
Most plants, when they come up, will have, 1 to 2 leaves. They're often called seed leaves. I wait for the plant to at least have 3 or 4 more leaves above the soil surface that are no longer these seed leaves before I would think about transplanting. And frankly, I don't count the leaves as much as what's the size of the plant? How tall is it getting compared to the size of the container that the roots are in? What I'm more worried about is making sure that the roots have space to grow.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think that's all the questions in the chat. Any questions in the room? Yeah.
The peat pellets, can you score them when you're putting them into the ground? Would that help?
Okay, the question is in regards to the peat pellets, or more like the peat pots.
Pots,
Yeah, if you can score them as you put them into the ground, if that would help.
Yeah, anything you can do to break the surface of the pot so that the roots can grow through would be helpful. What you don't want is it to be so dense early in the season that the roots can't get through and really allow the plant roots to grow and become basically like a containerized root, like an indoor plant will oftentimes get.
Does that help? Another question?
How about the moisture percentage when you talk about humidity or dehumidifying? Are you looking for 70% or 80% or what? How do you measure that and how do you control it?
So if you are lucky enough to have a hygrometer, you would like somewhere between 50 and 70%. If you get up in the 80% range, you're actually getting it too moist and you may have damping off or other disease problems. If it's below 50% air humidity, you're getting into pretty dry territory.
Can I answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. All right, any other questions in the room? We're not seeing anything. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks to all who attended online.
Okay. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.